Thank you all very much for coming. It's great to have a packed house tonight. I'm going to make this really brief so we can get to the speakers. Welcome to Webb versus Rocha, a debate sponsored by the Wabash College Newman Center. I'm Bob Cassidy, the president of the Newman Center. And before we begin, I just want to say this event is one in number, a series that we're having this semester. So every other Monday we're going to be having speakers. So just keep an eye out for emails on those. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen Webb, professor of... Take it away.
I almost expected Bob to say I'm not only a spokesperson for the toupee product, but I actually am a client too. It looks like he has. All right, for you. Thank you, Newman Center. Thank you, Bob and Zach and the other guys. Thanks especially for the poster. Although I thought it might have been a little funnier if you'd had a picture of us running down the sidewalk, with me in the lead, of course. So, but it's true. Sam did beat me. We had a sprint. For those of you who didn't know, Sam did beat me in the race. It was a little bit, well, it wasn't exactly fair. Right before it started, he asked me if I was in favor of affirmative action, and I paused to think about that, and he took off. I admit that Sam has more brawn than me, but I hope at the end of this debate you'll see that I have more brain than Sam. But you know, Sam's a big guy. He's a big guy. He and I were actually walking down the street the other day. We don't always sprint wherever we go. We were walking down the street the other day, and we saw a homeless man sitting on the side of the street, and he said, "Excuse me, sirs, I haven't eaten in 3 days." And Sam said, "Wow, I wish I had your willpower." I invited Sam to my office to go over the debates today. He was running a little bit late, and he said, "Sorry for the wait, Steve." And I said, "It's all right. You'll lose it someday." Some of you know that that I suffered some consequences for this sprint, and one of the things I was punished for, it was I don't know, it was like $500 a foot for that sprint that I had. But one of the things I was punished for was partial disrobement. I took my shirt off for the sprint, and this was evidently a major crime. So I thought today, if just to protect myself, I thought if I get carried away and take my shirt off, I want to be protected. I want to be very careful what I do. So I wore a T-shirt today, and it's a T-shirt that Mark and Ethan gave me. Obama Mao shirt. This was a shirt actually bought in China, and I don't think by Mark and Ethan. All right, that's it. No more humor. Let's get down to work, gentlemen. We're going to talk about Catholic social teaching and the nature of conservatism, or at least that's what I'm going to talk about. My thesis will be that the Catholic social teaching is essentially what conservatism is. It's a very conservative body of literature about social issues and social problems. Now, real quick, for those of you who don't know anything about Catholic social teaching comprises about 12, depending on how you number them, 12, 17, 18 documents. Almost all of them are papal letters or papal encyclicals. They're addressed to social, political, economic problems. And, but they shouldn't be taken as kind of economic analysis per se. They're deeply theological documents. The first one is, and they're known ordinarily, although sometimes they have English titles, but they're known ordinarily by the first two significant Latin words in them. And so, for example, the first one was released in 1891, is called Rerum Novarum, which means new things. The most recent one was released by Pope Benedict XVI, the current Pope, and it's called Caritatis in Veritate. Caritas in Veritate, charity and truth, or love and truth. And so, so it's a body of documents, right? But it obviously began before 1891. And this historical background is absolutely crucial to understanding what Catholic social teaching is. I mean, obviously the Church has always been teaching about economic and political issues. I mean, that goes back to the very beginning of Christianity. But the more immediate context of the Catholic social teaching, and what you have to understand Catholic social teaching, is the French Revolution. The French Revolution was an incredible cataclysmic event for the Catholic Church. The Church in France owned 10% of the land from which it derived its finances. It collected a 10% tax from everybody, which it distributed to the poor. When the National Association took over France, it deprived the Church of its income by confiscating its property, which subjected it to state control. The French state took over the task of caring for the poor and the sick. It took away the function of the Church to help the poor and made that a state function for the first time in history. The clergy became employees of the state. They were put on state payroll with very minimal salaries. Monasteries were shut down. Many clergy were killed, were kicked out of the country. Papal authority was abolished. The Pope had no authority in Rome, in France anymore. Because many priests resisted these changes, right? Churches were burnt down, priests were executed, and an effort was made to create a civil religion to take the place of Catholicism. There was a counter-revolutionary revolt in the area of Vendée in northwestern France. And some scholars say this was the first genocide because the French government, the French military went in there and targeted Catholics and killed tens and tens of thousands of them. So France took on a secular mission. That mission was perpetuated by Napoleon. It's still very much a part of French identity. It's still the secular mission that's behind much of European culture, which is extremely secular. Now, the Church's response to the French Revolution was what we call reactionary. Reactionary has become a bad word in political circles. You can be conservative, you can be liberal, but you're not supposed to be reactionary. Reactionary has a kind of menacing connotation to it. But it shouldn't. Sometimes you just have to react against things. And the Church definitely reacted against the French Revolution. Catholics became identified with the restoration of monarchy, nostalgia for earlier times, praise of rural life over cities, an emphasis on order and hierarchy and respect for tradition and authority. Catholic theologians began criticizing rationalism run rampant, the individualism set loose of moral frameworks, and an obsession with progress at all costs. And one of the things the Catholic Church latched onto was this critique of utopianism, this critique of the idea that you can make the world a perfect place. In fact, many Catholic theologians began arguing, or not began arguing, they drew from the rich tradition of Thomas Aquinas and natural theology and clarified their arguments that human nature is unchanging, right? And poverty is something that you have in society. And you can't recreate humanity. You can't re-engineer humanity. There's only so much you can do. And so social inequality, for example, is built into societies. Now, does this mean that we shouldn't do anything to redress social inequality? No, we'll talk about that. But it certainly means that any attempt to engineer a perfect society where everyone will be equal and where you can wipe out poverty is going against human nature and going against the inherent natural ways in which society is ordered. Of course, you can be charitable. And keep that in mind because Pope Benedict's most recent document is Charity in Truth, Caritas in Veritate. And so charity is important. But notice how charity, because of liberalism, because of the forces set loose by the French Revolution, has gotten a bad rep, a bad reputation, especially among in the academy, among liberals, among the cultural elite, because charity is seen as a token thing. We don't want charity, we want social transformation. We want welfare. We want government programs. Charity is not enough. And see, this is the radically conservative essence of Catholic social teaching, as reinforced in Pope Benedict's most recent encyclical, that change has to come from the heart. It has to be part of one's personal responsibility. And individuals giving to other individuals has to be at the heart of social transformation. You can't change people, you can't change society without the personal engagement of charity. So anyway, getting back to my story, the church was under siege. Socialism was emerging in the 19th century, even in Christian forms, very often in Christian forms. Intellectuals were beginning their long abandonment of Christianity in Europe to the point where we have what we have today, which is a Europe that is blatantly unchristian, and for all practical purposes has no more theological backbone or framework. The Catholic Church was the only institution with power and authority to try to stem the tide. The Church thus lambasted modernism in its Enlightenment form, especially the idea that you can be free to do whatever you want, and the idea that state and church should be completely separated. All throughout the Catholic social documents, you run into this again and again and again. The cardinal sin, if you will, of modernism, of the French Revolution, is to try to create a secular state, because the church firmly believes that no state can survive without religion. Even the French revolutionaries realized this. I mean, after they rebelled against the Catholic Church and began persecuting the Catholic Church, they created their own civil religion, their own civic rituals, and in a bid to try to take the place of the Catholic Church. Every society has to have a religious substance. Every government must be grounded in moral principles, which ultimately are grounded in theological convictions. And the Catholic Church preaches that, has always preached that, and of course I don't need to remind you or tell you that one of the great divides in modern politics between liberals and conservatives is that liberals typically believe in a high wall of separation of church and state, a phrase that's not even in the Constitution, as we all know, whereas conservatives believe that the church should be given freedom to participate in public affairs, that Christians should have a place at the table, that Christian morals and Christian values should be taught and honored and given a place in modern society. The church tried to stand against all these trends. Think of this. At the beginning of the 19th century, before the French Revolution, at the end of the 18th century, every European nation had a confessional basis. Every European nation was grounded in a church tradition, in a Christian tradition. By the end of the 19th century, virtually none of them. Especially if you bump the 19th century up to 1917 or so. But so the states, nation states, had been stripped of their theological foundations. And one of the most fascinating things about the Catholic social teaching is that the popes understood just how bad this was. When nation states are independent actors, with no grounding in any kind of moral framework, with no papacy to try to arbitrate disputes, then you get nationalism run amok. And that's exactly what happened in Europe. That's exactly what happened in Europe. You had nation states that increasingly turned against each other in orgies of bitter competition. You had European nations that started raping and pillaging Africa for political and economic advantage. And you had, of course, World War I and World War II, which was basically the collective suicide attempt of Europe. There's no other way to understand that, except that paganism became the de facto religion of Europe. You need a strong religious interpretation of the 20th century. It was a continent that had imploded, divided against itself, because it tried the experiment of going completely secular, which ends up becoming pagan, which ends up letting factors other than theology, other than common morality, guide nation states. Now, how did the church respond to this? Well, it responded in several ways. It's true that at the First Vatican Council, for example, the church tried to solidify its teaching about papal infallibility. The popes also started releasing syllabuses of error, basically books that you're not supposed to read. Now, of course, Protestants and even Catholics in America, and all Catholics today, these things seem reactionary. Remember that word. But you got to put it in a context. The church is trying to battle and defeat forces that were running amok. Did the church overreact? Think about World War I and World War II. It did not overreact. But the thing we're here to talk about today is one particular form of the reaction against the French Revolution, which we call Catholic social teaching. This form began in 1891 in the form of a document that we call Rerum Novarum, released as a letter by Pope Leo the 13th in 1891. Now, some people will argue. By the way, Rerum Novarum, if modern education was not so anti-Catholic to its very bones, Rerum Novarum would be required reading. For any course like C&T, well, we don't have required readings at Wabash anymore. All right, along with that text about how dolphins really do think, you would read Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum was the most prophetic, most insightful, and most helpful critique of social events, of the events giving rise to industrialization that was written in the 19th century. It anticipates the rise of fascism. It anticipates the rise of communism. It explains why socialism is so dangerous. It explains why family values are so important. It's an amazing document, and it was groundbreaking. And so it was groundbreaking in the church in the sense that every pope since 1891 has released his own social document teaching, sometimes 2 or 3, right? And they all quote Rerum Novarum. They all begin with Rerum Novarum. So I'm going to limit my remarks in the next 5 minutes or so that I have left to Rerum Novarum and...
You were talking for like 15 minutes already.
15 minutes? Yeah, but part of that was joking and part of that was background, historical background. Take the jokes out. Those were free. Those were free. Those weren't polemical. So, Rerum Novarum, okay. All right. Rerum Novarum is extremely critical of social action. It's extremely supportive of limited government, one of the keystones of conservatism. Why is it supportive of limited government? I'll tell you. Because the family is the true government. Think of that. You can't have social governance without people who learn to govern themselves. You can't do that. And people learn to govern themselves within families by listening to their parents, by learning what's right and wrong. You cannot have government without honoring the sacrality of the family. For parents to educate their children the way they want to give them the religion they want to give them, government cannot intervene into family life. Rerum Novarum emphasizes this point. Every subsequent pope has. And the importance of this point is that government has to be limited. And it's limited right there at the beginning because of the importance of family. The other point that Rerum Novarum really emphasizes is what we can call the doctrine of subsidiarity, what Leo calls the doctrine of subsidiarity. The doctrine of subsidiarity, it's a weird term for those outside of Catholic circles, but it's really an easy concept to learn. It just means that whatever you do as a society, you should do at the lowest social level that's possible. In other words, if you have a program or you're doing something to change the world, you should do that at the level where the authority is given, distributed as much as possible to the people you are impacting. Schools should be locally controlled. A good conservative principle. You don't want a nation state trying to tell everyone what to do. You want a distribution of power and authority as close to the people that you're impacting as possible. And then a third point of Rerum Novarum is its incredible critique of socialism. Let me just read this one paragraph to you, then I will shut up. The critique of socialism. Here's a great passage from Rerum Novarum. To remedy these wrongs, the socialists, working on the poor man's envy of the rich, are striving to do away with private property. Rerum Novarum, private property is essential. You can't. Why? Because you can't have people who practice charity and love without it. You can't have people have a strong sense of self-identity and personal responsibility without it. Private property is good. It's important. It's absolutely essential. So to remedy these wrongs, the socialists working on the poor man's envy of the rich are striving to do away with private property and contend that individual possession should become the common property of all, to be administered by the state or municipal bodies. They hold that by thus transferring property from private individuals to the community, the present mischievous state of things will be set to rights, inasmuch as each citizen will then get his or her fair share of what there is to enjoy. But their contentions are so clearly powerless to end the controversy that were they carried into effect, the working man himself would be among the first to suffer. They are, moreover, emphatically unjust, for they would rob the lawful possessor, distort the functions of the state, and create utter confusion in the community. And now, for utter confusion, I introduce to you Sam Rocha.
I'll yield my time on the questions and just get started. So, I can give him some space and I'll be fine. All right. So I'd also just like to say a few introductory things. And in some ways, these are more important than maybe what I have to say in general. The first thing is I'd like to thank the Newman Center, and I don't do so just sort of out of formality, but I hope that this event sort of shows people that the Newman Center, and in particular the Catholic Church, and when I say the Catholic Church, I don't necessarily always simply mean the Roman Catholic Church, although that's a tradition I can speak from most specifically, but the Catholic Church is much bigger than that, includes a wider range, you know, the Byzantines, other people who are in communion with the Pope, and other people, Orthodox and things like that. To say that basically the Catholic Church has a voice that is very different than the voices we're used to hearing. And insofar as that's the case, I think the Newman Center has a voice on this campus that might be very different than the ones we're used to hearing. And so I hope you can pay more and more attention to the Newman Center and to the voice they bring to the campus. The second thing I want to say is that we're used to hearing voices that argue in fairly petty ways, especially on our news networks. And I hope that you can see also today, at least through our example, that Webb and I are friends, okay? All right? Now I'm going to say some pretty tough stuff about him in a little bit. But I hope you can see that agonism doesn't necessarily mean antagonism, right? So to see the difference between the two. One can be agonistic without being antagonistic. The final thing I want to say is to those who have decided to rumor, without talking to me about it, about the inherent chauvinism of this event, I'd like people to know that any society and any time or any place in which open, free, intellectual, and public discourse and debate becomes a taboo, the converse becomes a very real and a very dangerous option. So I would be very careful about what one would say about a forum such as this. Let me just get started, and I'll start where Webb basically left off. Before I get into Rerum Novarum, I'd like to say that the Church's Catholic social teaching isn't just about its sense of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is sort of the teachings that you need to follow. That's certainly a big part of it. But there's this other side of the Catholic social teaching that's something more like orthopraxy. In other words, the practices that in some sense inform and create the doctrines of orthodoxy, right? And we can find these practices, and in fact we can find these teachings much further back than the French Revolution, although a lot of what Webb said I wouldn't dispute there. But we can go as far back as, for instance, Deuteronomy, which talked about the after 7 years we have sort of a year of forgiveness. We can see the Jubilee year. You can see the story of King David, who was sort of kind of this great underdog story, right? All the way from his election to be the successor of Paul to, you know, the fight with Goliath that we all know about. We can see in the Incarnation at the story of the Nativity in Luke's infancy narrative, the poorly state in which Christ comes into the world. We can see in the Passion of all the Gospels this particular theme. All these themes, as they work themselves into the early church, you got to realize during the early church, the economic model that we live in, making money on money, was itself illegal. It was illegal in the early church to make money on money. And the early church fathers, from Augustine to St. John Chrysostom to Jerome, all of them had rather nasty things to say about this. And as we continue through history, we can see that for 1,500 years, before modernity really begins, the church had a set of practices which included mendicant orders like Franciscans and Dominicans, which included monks, and included many, certainly abuses in other cases, but on the margins of the church was always this particular prophetic, mystic, and poorly voice that continually rang out again and again. And then we find ourselves within this era of modernity, and we see the church, as Webb very well put it, was very resistant, and to some extent still is and ought to be, of modernity itself, of this era, which included not only the economics of modernity, but also the politics of modernity, which are at their core liberal, okay? If you are a so-called conservative, you probably adhere to principles that at the dawn of the modern age were liberal, and that's just a historical fact that cannot be disputed. But going beyond that, as we go into modernity, we see that the popes begin to engage modernity in the 19th century, and certainly Rerum Novarum is one of them. And one of the most striking quotes from Rerum Novarum is a quote that might sound a little strange to you if you heard Webb's depiction of Rerum Novarum. Leo the 13th, in paragraph 22, says something to this extent. I'm going to paraphrase because it's kind of antiquated and crusty, but he says basically, once you have satisfied all of your material needs, and once those needs have been kept within the propriety of your class, everything you own belongs to the poor. Now, that's not necessarily saying we should all become socialists, but it is expressing something that's at the very heart and at the very core of Catholic social teaching, and it's a term that's been coined probably within the last 20 years, but something that's true throughout Scripture, tradition, praxis, and certainly within the encyclicals. And that is called, write it down, the preferential, you have a pen out, Webb? It's called the preferential option for the poor. The preferential option for the poor. And the preferential option for the poor goes down deep into the very bottom and the recesses of Catholic social teaching, which say that basically any doctrine, any ideology, whether we call it conservatism, liberalism, socialism, capitalism, democracy, whatever, fascism, any ideology that violates this essential tenet of Scripture, of tradition, and of the documents of the Church, this preferential option for the poor, is basically something that should make serious Catholics tremble. Let me put it a little bit more directly. If there's a system or an ideology of economics or politics that has a preferential option for the rich, that is the exact converse of the preferential option for the poor. Right? Now, it's not too hard to imagine, and it's not too hard to see the fact that the way in which Webb has read Catholic social teaching is very convenient for his own particular affiliations, ideologies, and general persona, right? But the church would ask that Webb be a bit more serious about the way he sees and interprets not only his own politics, but the politics of the day. Here's the last point I want to make. Besides this preferential option for the poor that's at the very core of Catholic social teaching, there's also a basic idea that one does not go to Adam Smith to read about capitalism or to Marx to read about Marxism or socialism and read them and then infuse them after the fact into the gospel. The Church's stance on Catholic social teaching and on the way we interpret Scripture in general is that one brings the gospel to bear on the secular documents of the day. I think you can tell very quickly that Webb's reading of Rerum Novarum and of the church history in general has its polarity backwards, exactly backwards. Where Webb brings to bear his obvious sort of, anti-statist, and I'm not a statist either. I mean, who is, right? It's fun for playing on MSNBC and Fox and petty circus acts like that. But at the serious level, who is, right? The point I'm making, though, is that Webb's reading of Catholic social teaching is not wrong from a historical standpoint necessarily, or even from a scholarly standpoint. It's wrong from a matter of vision. Now, Webb's deaf, but he's not blind, right? So the point I want to make is that Webb reads Catholic social teaching through the lens of the grand old party, through the lens of the Republican Party. And whether he read it through that party, or through the Democratic Party, or through the Socialist Party, or through the Solidarity Party of Spain, which is probably my favorite party these days, regardless, until Webb begins to read Catholic social teaching through the heart and the eyes of the Church, for all his erudition, he will never begin to understand anything from the preferential option to the poor, or the implications of this deep and rich tradition of praxis, the practices of monks, the practices of religious communities, the practices of basically the entire tradition of the church that they rest upon. So here are my two contentions. One, that until Webb can prove that the preferential option for the poor is somehow eroded through his obviously misguided sensibilities about his reading of papal documents and of Catholic social teaching. And two, until he's able to show us that he can give an honest reading to the Church's documents, not a reading that's slanted or preempted through the lens of secular politics. Not only is he not a faithful Catholic, he's also a very faithful secularist.
Yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church has a lot to teach me. It has a lot to teach me about being a better person and about being more generous. One of the more interesting psychological or sociological studies done in recent years was taking people who self-identify as church-going, regular church-going, devout Christians, and take people who self-identify as strong liberals and asking them how much money they give away. And also doing, asking them their permission to see the records there. And all these studies point out that come to the same conclusion. Conservative Christians give away a much greater amount of their money to charity than liberals do. And I've actually done this as a personal experiment of my own. I won't embarrass anyone here, but I've asked several faculty friends of mine who are liberals. I've said, well, how much money do you give away a year? Well, I remember one told me, well, I belong to the Sierra Nevada Club. or whatever that environmentalist club is. I was like, oh, really? Well, that's good. How much? What do you do? Well, I give them $50, and they send me a magazine. I said, all right. Well, what else? Well, that's it. I'm like, really? Now, it's hard to be generous, but that's what we're called to do. The state isn't called to create more and more administrative layers of bureaucratized compassion that keeps us from actually engaging with each other. We're called to be generous. You know, we're called to adopt orphans, to take care of the elderly, and to give to the poor. And that's hard to do. And certainly the church still has a lot to do with me on that, although I do try to do that. Back to Rerum Novarum. You know, look, the Catholic Church has sometimes been criticized for being too hard on socialism and communism. But let me just suggest to you that what I said about personal property is not, it is exactly what Pope Leo says about personal property. The rights being spoken of belonging to each individual man are seen in a much stronger light when considered in relation to man's social and domestic obligations. In choosing a state of life, it is indispensable that all are at full liberty to follow the counsel of Jesus Christ. No human law can abolish natural and original right of marriage, the principal purpose of which is to increase and multiply. Hence we have the family, the society of a man's house, a society very small, one must admit, but nonetheless a true society, and one older than the state. Consequently, it has rights and duties. One of those rights is the right to property. Here's a direct quote. The right to property, therefore, which has been proved to belong naturally to individual persons, must and likewise belong to a man in capacity as head of family. And that right is all the more important in our day-to-day, in our society today, and whatnot. In fact, actually, the Catholic social teaching really was ahead of the curve in saying we need more ownership in society, not less. We need to extend the right of property to as many people as possible. Ownership is good. It creates responsibility. It creates demands that you use your freedom wisely. Of course, it also gives you the opportunity to use your freedom poorly. But ownership is good. Property is good. And that's something that liberals on the side of a kind of quasi-non-statist socialism, whatever that would be, can't seem to understand. All right, have I used up all my time? I'm not sure. Maybe at some point. Look, this claim that conservatives are really liberals in disguise, Sam and I went around on this in a magazine, and it's too obscure of a debate, I think, to get into here. But let me just close by saying that personal change has to begin with yourself. You should try to change yourself first before you try to vote for a political party that's promising you some program to change others on your behalf. That the hardest kind of charity is the charity you practice as an individual. And that, in point of fact, when you take charity out of the hands of individuals and transfer it to the state, you're going to really screw things up. You're going to make charity disappear, because then charity becomes the mandated redistribution of wealth. It becomes something people feel entitled to, and it gives people the irresponsibility of not giving money away themselves. Am I against all forms of welfare? Of course not. Of course not. And conservatives are not. Conservatives are for safety nets, definitely. But they're also for some basic principles, and those principles can be found in Catholic social teaching. Human nature is the same everywhere. Any society, you're going to get people who are going to be poor. Poverty is not something that you can eliminate. But it's something that should be the object of your charity. It certainly should be. It should be a massive concern. If a Christian is not giving money away, if a Christian is not thinking about adopting, if a Christian is not doing something to change the world for the better, then the Christian is not a Christian. But those things take place best in the church and not in the government. Thanks.
So let's begin by giving Webb the credit that he only mildly alluded to, but probably deserves more credit certainly than me in this regard, is that obviously Webb has a tradition of orthopraxy in his very own home that is a compelling witness, I think, to the preferential option to the poor, his own practice of adoption. So I don't want to come on too strong. But let me come on strong in two other ways. A, you notice obviously that he didn't engage with anything I said before, hopefully. And so since he obviously doesn't have much to say to me, I'll go back to what he said at the beginning and just continue going where I was. So there's something that Webb said at the very beginning, and the one thing that he seemed to carry over across to his sort of thing that he just did there. This idea that social inequality and poverty is some sort of normative aspect of society. That's sort of the natural order of society is ordered in such a way, wow, there's a lot of you, is ordered in such a way that, that the poor are there. And there's compelling, in some extent, evidence for this, right? We're probably familiar scripture of like, you will always have your poor, right? Let's be careful about this. Natural law, which I would suppose Webb would be familiar with, clearly does not say that the natural order is the order of which is fallen. The most natural order of things is the order that precedes the fallen nature of the world, right? So I don't think there was any poor in the Garden of Eden. I maybe missed a meeting or something, but that's clearly not the case. So first of all, there's nothing about Catholic social teaching that says that sort of poverty is some kind of extra normative in the theological sense thing, but there is this idea that you will always have your poor. And Benedict XVI raised this question early on in his pontificate, when he basically said that a world in which a world of total equality would be a world where you would need no love. Okay, and this to some extent sounds like it might lend credence to Webb's point. But I want to show you just how secular Webb's reasoning is and be very clear about it. Webb, throughout this entire debate, has largely launched himself against a straw man, a person who doesn't exist, some kind of liberal statist who probably voted for Obama or whatever. That's not me. I'm just a Catholic guy. That's why I'm talking here and not at one of these other, that's why I don't mind not taking a secular holiday on Labor Day, right? I mean, I'm totally fine with that. Now, the point, though, is that both conservatives and so-called liberals on both sides largely think of questions of social justice and questions of social change and poverty through the lens of justice, of how do you sort of right what is wrong or this or that. Catholic social teaching is radically different. And Benedict XVI makes this clear not only in his most recent encyclical, but in the one before that, Deus Caritas Est, God is Love, where he says that the primary principle of all Catholic social teaching flows from the origin and from the originary font of love. And there's a big difference between having a logic of love and charity grounding your Catholic social teaching and a logic of justice. And it might not seem obvious to you, but the obvious difference is that basically the question of distribution no longer becomes a question of what is owed or a question of desert, right? A question of what I deserve and what others don't deserve. It becomes a question of charity. And although Webb's used the term charity in a fairly unsophisticated way, as sort of the charity we give to people, on the streets, charity at its root core is maybe basically the name for God for most Catholics, from John 1, right? God is love. And so I guess I would end by how much time do I have, Bob? Am I out? 2 minutes? So I want to end by making the same 2 points that I made before. And unfortunately, Webb hasn't given me a lot of traction from which to make these points very sharply, but I'll make them anyway because they're true, and that should be good enough. Number one, against Webb's claim that poverty is normative, poverty is certainly here to stay in our fallen nature, but there's nothing about that normative and the weak sense state of things that's anything we should be celebrating. It should be something that keeps us up at night. And it's precisely that which motivates this idea of the preferential option for the poor. Two, insofar as one advocates for any kind of affiliations that hold clear preferential options for the rich, such as many forms of capitalism, including forms of capitalism that are quite popular to talk about today, clearly there's something wrong. Trickle-down politics in terms of the idea of capitalism sort of trickling down is clearly a preferential option for the rich. This is in the exact converse relationship to Catholic social teaching. And three, the last point, is that Webb's sort of charade today is clearly showing us that he doesn't really work his way from the church into politics. He works his way from politics into the church. And as long as this inversion remains the case and the way he begins to try and see and understand things, he will never be able to access, despite his incredible erudition and despite the fact that he's obviously has practical and practices that are far beyond my own in terms of adoption and things like that. But he won't be able to speak with the voice of the church because he's sort of inverted his way in. So for these three reasons, one, that Webb is wrong about the normative idea of the poor will always be with you and the way he sort of distorted that. B, because he's clearly not addressed the idea of the preferential option to the poor and its relationship to capitalism. And 3, because the fact that he's continually shown us through his things up here that he brings politics into the church and not the church into politics. Webb is clearly misguided not only on the normative value of the poor and their role in the church, on the church's actual teaching, and on his own relationship between a secular world and the world of the church. And I hope that's clear.
What do you say?
Do you have a conclusion or should we do questions and answers?
Do I have a minute? Can I say something? 3 minutes? Oh, great. Look, I just want to boil this debate down to 2 things. One is this whole notion of charity, whether charity is a kind of practice that you can do without regard to orthodoxy. This distinction between orthodoxy and orthopraxis is not a Catholic distinction. It's not a good distinction at all. In point of fact, the Catholic social teaching and any Christian theology will tell you that charity, without being grounded in the teaching, the full teaching of the gospel, is not useful. In fact, this is what Benedict XVI said in his most recent encyclical. Let me quote this. Quote, "In the present social and cultural context, where there is a widespread tendency to relativize truth, practicing charity in truth," and that means in the fullness of the truth, as you are generous to others, as you give to others, you can't just be generous to them and say it doesn't matter what they believe, that it doesn't matter what they believe about God. It's tied together. So in truth helps people to understand that adhering to the values of Christianity is not merely useful but essential for building a good society. A Christianity of charity without truth would be more or less interchangeable with a pool of good sentiments, helpful for social cohesion, but of little relevance. Christian charity without the emphasis on truth, that there is truth in the world, that there is a God, that the Bible makes demands on us, that we have responsibilities and duties, that there are things we should believe. Charity taken away from that is useless. Faith without works is dead, but works without faith is not very helpful either. So you need the two together. And charity is thus best practiced as a form of Christian witness. It's best practiced through the church and through other individuals who are led by the Spirit of God. Now, the other point I wanted to make was this whole question of the naturalness of poverty. And I think Sam and I probably are pretty close on this. But again, let me read a quote from the Catholic social teaching. "Christian realism, while appreciating on the one hand the praiseworthy efforts being made to defeat poverty, is cautious on the other hand regarding ideological positions and messianic beliefs that sustain the illusion that it is possible to eliminate the problem of poverty completely from this world. This will happen only upon Christ's return," end quote. That's official Catholic teaching. That wasn't me. Now, be careful here. Just because we will always have the poor with us does not mean you can't care about them. You have to care about them if you're a Christian. There's no choice there. What it means is that when someone comes up to you and tells you that if we expand government, if we give it more authority, if we sacrifice some of our freedoms to the government, and the government's going to ensure that people won't be poor anymore, that's when you know that that's an illusion. That's an idealistic utopian hope that has no basis in reality. And furthermore, it involves a transfer of power and authority to an institution, the state, that does not deserve that power and that will distort that power. And in the end, rich people won't be hurt the most by that. Poor people will. Who did welfare hurt in the 60s and 70s in America? It was poor communities that were given the option of having children without parents, that were given the option of not working, that were given the option of becoming dependent on the government, like a narcotic drug. Welfare of a certain kind, when it's abused, is not good for the poor. Charity, when it is offered as part of the gospel message, when it's offered out of love from an individual, is absolutely necessary and is absolutely what we are all called to do. Thanks.
So we've got about, I don't know, 12 minutes to do questions and answers. Professor Brewer?
I'd like to ask a quick question, Professor, just so you can all hear me. A quick question, Professor Rocha. You said that you, the preferential treatment for the poor, I understand that it's not for trickle-down economics. What I want to know is what sort of political implications does preferential treatment of the poor, on your view, entail that would not be consistent with basically Republican policy?
Sure.
Can you kind of repeat that question a little bit?
Okay, why don't you just come up and say it, Mark? You're better than I am at that.
You'll do better at paraphrasing than I would.
I don't know if that's true. Professor Brewer wants to know, given my claim that the preferential option to the poor stands in sort of direct conflict with certain trickle-down economics models, what implication does that bear upon Webb's position within sort of Republican Party economics that I would disagree with directly, right? So I have a few things I want to say about this. One of the first things I want to say is that it's very easy in politics to caricature sides. So for instance, the so-called right likes to caricature the left as socialist and assume that that word means one thing, right? That's not true. But it's also not true for one to caricature capitalism as though it means one thing, right? There are many different forms of capitalism. There are many different forms of socialism. A lot of you probably think we live in a capitalist society, but there are a lot of socialist institutions that work quite well for us, from national parks to libraries to maybe the public school system works well for us. I think there's a lot of work we could do on that. But the point I want to make, though, is that I don't want to fall into sort of a facile caricature, but I will say one thing that seems to be clear. And Webb, if you think this is unjust, I'd happily like to hear what you have to say about it. But there's been this idea running through the rhetoric of the Republican Party that insofar as the rich are well fed, the poor will be fed as well. There's this basic idea that, insofar as we provide for the opulent, the rich, that the less advantaged will benefit in clear ways. Let's take Bill Gates, for instance. And this hits home because I was a Gates scholar. He paid for all my school, right? Bill Gates, a lot of people, they say, well, what do you want? Bill Gates to shut down Microsoft, lay off everybody, and go off somewhere? And I always say, well, if we read this through Catholic social teaching, if Bill Gates wants to say one day that he's going to give up everything he has, give it to the poor, and follow Christ, okay, right? I mean, that doesn't seem like that's a bad thing. I mean, the implication whenever people ask this sort of question is like, oh, well, if the rich close down all their factories and go on their yachts and leave us, what will we do? But Catholic social teaching doesn't just ask that sort of the rich sort of shut down factories and let everyone starve. The whole idea, going back to Reverend Navarro in paragraph 22, is that once you have provided for yourself in a way that is equitable, just, and within your social state, everything that you have belongs to the poor, right? So I think the implication is fairly clear that the preferential option for the poor would have radical effects, not only for the sort of policies of this trickle-down economics rhetoric that the Republican Party likes to use, but also upon the very people who inhabit both parties. Guys, look, we have a one business party with two basic heads. But everybody's rich. Everyone thinks it was radical that we elected Obama because he was maybe black, but it would be much more radical if we elected a poor president, right? A poor president is the most radical thing we can elect. It's also impossible. And the very conditions for the impossibility of having a poor president shows how radical Catholic social teaching really is and the ways in which it challenges us. So it doesn't just challenge specific policies like this rhetoric about trickle down. It also challenges the very edifice upon we base our assumptions about how politics should work, in terms of the powered and the disempowered and the relationships we make there. I don't know if that answers.
Reverend Navarro does not say anywhere that above your sustenance needs, everything you have belongs to the poor. It says everything you have should be considered in terms of the common good. And the idea is that you should be amassing wealth for yourself and your family, but thinking about what you're going to do with the excess wealth. It doesn't belong to the poor, it belongs to you. Rerum novarum is about personal property. But of course, and as good Wabash men, you should yourself think about this. Wabash is here because Wabash men have thought of their wealth as something they should do for others, and have given a hell of a lot of it back to Wabash College, as well as other charitable organizations. Now, in terms of wealth in America, yes, yes, there are a lot of independent centers of wealth in America. But think about this. Would you rather live in a country where the government has the most money, or would you rather live in a country where there are hundreds of thousands of really wealthy people? Lots and lots of extremely wealthy people. It's messy. They all have their own agendas. They all have their own seat of power. Many, many, many of them do a lot of good with their money. Many of them just keep it in the stock market or put it right back into business, which also is a good with that money. But that's part of the American experience, is limiting government through centers of economic wealth that are outside of the control of the government. Liberalism in this country often plays on the idea that the Republican Party just loves wealth, or that liberals are really the people who are suspicious of wealth and Republicans aren't. But there's really a lot of social good from having a society where wealth is not regulated by the government. And so I think that that's part of personal responsibility. Some wealthy people handle their money well, some people don't. But that's part of their personal responsibility. Yeah?
Can I quickly have a rejoinder?
No, let's someone say.
Just real quick. Just one time, man. I was cool about your first thing you did. So I'm not going to be long. All I want to say is this is exact proof of the sort of skewed, inverted way that Webb interprets Catholic social teaching. So to just settle the deal, I'm just going to read you paragraph 22 from Rerum Novarum, and you can decide what it says. Okay. Therefore, those whom fortune favors are warned that riches do not bring freedom from sorrow and are of no avail for eternal happiness, but rather are obstacles. That the rich should tremble at the threatenings of Jesus Christ. How must one's possessions be used? A little later on. The church replies without hesitation in the words of the same holy doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas. Man should not consider his material possessions as his own, but as common to all, so as to share them without hesitation when others are in need. But when, and here's the good one, what necessity demands have been supplied, and one's standing fairly taken thought for, it becomes a duty to give to the indigent, the poor, out of what remains over. Of that which remaineth, give alms.
Can I correct this quote I have?
No, actually, you don't get a rebuttal.
Sam left out this line. I saw him skip right over it. This is not a quote from another person. This is Leo himself speaking. Private ownership, as we have seen, is the natural right of man, and to exercise that right, especially as members of society, is not only lawful, but absolutely necessary. Sam also missed this little point from Leo's quote here. True, no one is commanded to distribute to others that which is required for his own needs and those of his household, nor even to give away what is reasonably required to keep up becomingly his condition in life. No one's required. Isn't that amazing? God created a world where you're free to be a greedy bastard.
Sit down, Webb.
But it is a duty, not of justice, but of Christian charity, a duty not enforced by human law, but by the law of God. Be careful if you're a greedy bastard, because God will hold you in a lot higher judgment than the liberal party in America will ever will. All right.
Any other questions?
I noticed that war and violence was kind of ignored during the conversation. I was wondering if Professor Webb, who's so critical of more and more power, authority, and money going to the federal government, would be at all critical of the military expansionism supported by both parties, but particularly forcefully by people we can call conservatives in this country. And I was also wondering, Professor Webb with your emphasis on subsidiarity, and I would also suppose personalism, if you would be at all critical of globalized capitalism, which violates both of those.
Well, I mean, globalization is, there are many globalizations. You know, Sam pointed out there are many, many capitalisms, many, so globalization is a really tricky, interesting question. But the question of the military, I think America does spend too much money on the military. I think there is typically a divide between liberals and conservatives, however, on this issue. Do we live in a friendly world where we can trust other people? Again, you see the idealism, the utopianism creeping in, or do we live in a scary world where we can't trust other people? And you see something a little bit more realistic about others. Conservatives tend to think that the kinds of freedoms that America supports and the kind of freedoms that are built into Christianity, the freedoms of personal responsibility, freedom of religion, that these freedoms are actually not held in high regard by other countries, and that, you know, that we have to have a pretty strong investment in a military to defend those freedoms. And so, but to me, again, that's not really that big of a divide issue, because most, in terms of elected officials, most Democrats and Republicans are not all that, I mean, you know, one wants a cut of 10%, one wants a cut of 5%. It's not really that crucial of an issue, but I think it does get at a certain kind of tendency of idealism in liberal thought, an idealism that kind of wishes away foreign conflict, international conflict.
If I can say something quick, I think this is an excellent example, again, of, well, I mean, Webb just talked about liberals and conservatives, but said very little about Catholic social teaching, which is basically unequivocal, especially if we take into account the Ubi et Orbi speeches and homilies given by both Pope John Paul II and Benedict XVI during our occupations in both Iraq and Afghanistan, which have just completely been against it. And personalism is important to take into account too within Catholic social teaching. I'm not a big fan, and I'm glad Webb didn't do this. Of a lot of people like to turn it into, here are the 10 principles of Catholic social, or the 7, you know. I'm not entirely sure that's a good way, but one of the most cherished principle, and one that I don't think we actually disagree about, is the sacredness and dignity of the human person, and by extension, the sacredness and dignity of all of creation, right? But there is a strong voice that Catholicism inserts into this rather unified front. As Webb puts it, Democrats and Republicans, as I said, aren't that different. You know, they agree on this generally, that, you know, they want to be, you know, warmongers in general. And the point that it brings us to is that the Catholic Church has a very different stance about these things. It's not one that makes a lot of people happy on either side, but it's one that's very real. The other thing I'll say, though, about one of the things Webb said is, get away from me, you know? You're making me work. You know, Webb would have you believe that I believe in the abolition of private property, apparently. But you do notice that all of these quotes says, after you've taken for yourself what you need, then the rest is owed to the poor. So nothing about this follows that you have to not own anything. In fact, one of the most consistent, you know, receptacles of Catholic social teaching into doctrine is this idea of distributism that Hilaire Belloc and Chesterton brought to the fore around the turn of the century. And it's largely based in basically the restoration, this is one of the essays of Belloc, right? The restoration of property. But it's the restoration of property with the restraint that gives everything after I've taken my own to the poor. Webb was making fun of me about my weight somehow. Okay, that's fine. But Webb is basically condoning the politics of overeating in this very debate. He's basically saying you can be a greedy bastard. In other words, you can go and eat as much as you want. The Catholic Church doesn't say you have to starve. You can even eat as much as I do if you'd like. But it says that after you've had your fill, everything else that is left doesn't belong to you. Even if you own it, it belongs to the poor. And so that's the way that the church thinks, and it's not really the way that Webb seems to be thinking.
It's not owed.
Wait, we are out of time, and obviously they want to stay and keep talking. So if you guys want to stay, you're welcome to. But if people need to leave right now, that's fine as well. So, all right.